It's April 1st, 2019. My name is Gareth Aden, and it's my pleasure and honor today to be taking the oral history of one of the past presidents of the Nashville Bar Association, John Kitch. John, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Gareth.
I think the best thing to do is start at the very beginning. Could you give us your birth date and where you were born?
I was born July 26, 1946 in Plymouth, Indiana.
And where is Plymouth, John?
It's northern Indiana, 25 miles south of South Bend and about 30 miles south of the Michigan state line.
Tell me a little bit about your parents.
My father, Don, was a lawyer in Plymouth, and my grandfather, for that matter, was a lawyer in Plymouth and a judge as well. My mom was a homemaker, and she passed when I was about 8 years old, and Dad remarried, and my subsequent mother, my adoptive mother, Audrey, adopted me, and she lived to be 105. I wish I'd had her genes, but I didn't.
How about any other brothers or sisters?
Well, a little background. My father was in World War I in the American Expeditionary Forces, and from his first wife, Marie, he had my half-brother, Bob, who was 24 years older than me,
Wow.
my half-sister, Burl, who was 20 years older than me, and my half-sister, Lee, who was 16 years older than me. And my brother, Bob, was actually in World War II on a submarine.
Tell me about your childhood and what you did.
You know, back in those days, it was get on your bicycle, go out and ride around, do whatever you wanted, but come home when the street lights came on. It's a small town. It was about 7,000 people in a rural county, and nothing like today where you had to watch out. I mean, everybody just went out and had a good time, played baseball in the vacant lot, and that sort of thing.
Since it was a small town, I'm guessing that your dad's practice was a general practice.
Yes, very much. As a matter of fact, he was licensed on November 1st of 1929, just a few days after the crash, and got paid a lot in eggs and hams and things like that because there was no money.
How about school? I presume that you went to elementary and high school there in Plymouth?
Public schools, all of them, Jefferson Elementary, Lincoln Junior High, and Plymouth High School. And they were just your typical public school, nothing remarkable about any of them other than that I felt like I got a pretty good education out of them, prepared me enough to go on after that.
Exactly, and I presume that you made good grades.
Reasonably so. National Honor Society, I think I got in, it was the top 10% of the class, and I think I was 13th out of 129. And they rounded up.
Did you participate in, school sports or Boy Scouts or anything like that? Or?
I was cut from my junior high basketball team that then went 0-22 my senior year of high school, which should tell me about my athletic skills. But I was involved in some other things. There was something created by Walt Powers, my senior English teacher, called Alpha Delta Rho, which stood for Alpha being the first developmental reading. And what it was, we read the 10 books that changed the world, or pieces of them, and then discussed them, and that was fun. And I was in the high school marching band and concert band and jazz band. That took up a fair share of time, and that's pretty much what I did.
So that brings us to about 1964, which I think would be your graduation.
That is correct. I graduated in 1964.
And what did young John Kitch decide to do upon graduation?
Well, he went off to a liberal arts school that wasn't terribly liberal. It was Manchester College in northern Indiana, which was run by the Church of the Brethren, which I like to say was the liberal wing of the Mennonites, but not terribly liberal. And I was there for a year. And quite frankly, at the end of that year, both the school and I decided that it wasn't a very good fit, and so I didn't go back.
Ah, so in the spring of 1965, what did you decide to do?
Well, I worked. I found a job, I can't even remember what it was, but I found a job and worked and knew that the draft would be coming, and so I just waited until probably October or November and went down to the local selective service board and suggested that I wanted to move my name up on the draft. And there was a reason for that. I happened to know that everybody from my home county was going to be going to Fort Polk, Louisiana. And when I checked, I was going to go in July and August. And for those who have ever been to Louisiana in July and August, I don't know if I can say this, but it's hotter than the hinges of hell. And so I figured that if I went earlier, it might well be a little bit better. And so I pushed my name up on the draft. They called it volunteering for the draft. And so I was drafted January 10th, 1966, and true to form was sent to Fort Polk.
And how long did you stay at Fort Polk?
Fort Polk was 8 weeks of basic training, and then after basic training, I thought that I was going to wind up being sent to, or being kept at Fort Polk for advanced infantry training, and then promptly sent to Vietnam. But as luck would have it, I was sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma to work on the Pershing missile as a crewman. I remember I was an enlisted man, I was not an officer. And so I was a Pershing missile crewman. That was an 8-week program in Fort Sill. And after completing that, was sent over to Germany to serve in a Pershing missile battalion. The only 2 places in the world they had Pershing missiles was at Fort Sill and in Germany.
John, that's fascinating. You know, from what little I know, the Pershing is it a mobile nuclear
Yes.
tactical missile?
Yes, it's it and its component parts, the warhead, the command center, the radio rig, which is ultimately what I worked in, and the main body of the missile are all mounted on converted armored personnel carriers, tracked vehicles. And it was a nuclear weapon, and my understanding of it, of course, they didn't tell us enlisted men a whole lot, but from my understanding of it, we were aimed at the Fulda Gap in case the Russian tanks came through. And we were the first line of stopping those Russian tanks.
Where in Germany, was it one place that you were primarily assigned to?
Yes, it was a little place called Wackernheim, which was about 8 miles outside of Mainz-Wiesbaden, about 25 miles from Frankfurt. And we were the only people on that particular post other than one company of a transportation group.
And how long did you spend on the Pershing missile team?
18 months. That was, I went over after basic training and advanced training, got over there in the summer, I guess, late spring, early summer of 1966, and rotated back to the United States in December of '67 in time to have a Christmas leave. And then they sent me to Fort Sheridan on the North Shore of Chicago for 1 week in order to muster out of active duty. And I'll never forget, they took away my overcoat, and in January in Chicago, you kind of like to have an overcoat. And,
Just a parting thank you.
Yes, it was kind of, yeah, and I did absolutely nothing for that entire week except sit around and wait for the paperwork.
Your year and a half or so in Germany, did that sort of play any part that's memorable or important in your life?
Well, the military experience, as I have said, I wouldn't take $1 million for what I learned, and mostly what I learned was personal development, self-discipline. Certainly I had none when I went in, and it doesn't take the Army very long to teach you discipline of varying forms and the consequences for a lack of discipline. And so that was very important. It taught me how to blend in and work with people from all cultural, ethnic, racial backgrounds, because it was pretty much a melting pot for me. And so I learned a great deal personally. Now, of course, at the time I was 19 years old and really knew nothing, and I'm not going to say I knew that much when I got out, but that was what I had learned. So other than that, it was pretty much get out and then figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life.
So I take it by the spring of 1968, when you had mustered out of the service, you were about 20 years old or thereabouts?
No, actually, let's see, I would have been about 22, I think.
Okay.
Well, no, 21 going on 22.
What did you do?
Well, I had a high school friend who had been in the Army as well. He got out a little before me. He was a medic in Vietnam, and he decided he wanted to go to Perdue University. And he and I had talked about whether I was interested in going. I told you I was a Pershing missile crewman, but when I got to Germany, they made me a microwave radio operator with the unit, because all of the people that had done that, they had already sent home. And so I learned that on the job training and did that for the bulk of the time I was over there, and thought I knew a lot about electronics and that sort of thing. And so I talked with my friend George, and we bought a house trailer together and moved it down to a house trailer park near campus. He started a year before I did. I would go down and visit, and then so I decided I would apply to Purdue, and I did, and was accepted. The interesting element of that was that shortly before, I guess a couple of months before I was due to go down, I got a letter from the Army telling me to report to summer camp, because after my active duty of 2 years, I was in the active reserve for 2 years, and then would be followed by the inactive reserve. Well, as it turned out, that active reserve obligation was to go to summer camp. And, I panicked because I'd already been accepted to school, and I may or may not have already paid my initial tuition. I don't recall that for sure. So I wrote him a letter saying, can I put that 2 weeks off to another time, because I've been accepted to Purdue and want to go down there and study. And I got a letter back fairly promptly. Of course, this is well before emails and that sort of thing, so it's through the U.S. mail. There was a delay, and so there was anxiety waiting for a response. And the response was, disregard any and all further orders concerning summer camp or any further obligations in the military. And I thought about it, and I said, well, that's a little bit odd, but then it came to me that in the fall of 1968, they had so many people coming back from Vietnam that they had no problem filling slots in the active reserve, or for that matter, assigning people to the inactive reserve. And so I wound up, for the 4 years I should have had an obligation, basically doing nothing connected with the military.
When you got to Purdue, did you like it?
Oh, loved it. Still go back. It's a great school. I started off in electrical engineering because I thought that my military background, with microwave radio rigs would be helpful. As it turned out, not so much. As I have said many times, I met Mr. Calculus and he beat me up. And I met Madam Physics, and she helped. And so after a couple of years, you know, where I was a C student, I was doing all right, but I was certainly not tearing up the league. I decided that perhaps that wasn't for me, and so I shifted majors to political science, and that's ultimately the degree I got from Purdue, Bachelor of Arts.
At that time, had you given any thought to law practice? I know you had a father and a grandfather who were in practice.
Well, my grandfather passed before I was born. My dad never really pushed me in that direction, although I'm sure he would have been happy to know that I went that way. He passed when I was just out of high school. And I hadn't really thought about it that much, but what happened was I realized in about the beginning of my senior year at Purdue that with a political science degree I could either go get a master's and then a doctorate and teach in a college or university, or go to law school. And the idea of going after 2 more degrees when I could spend 3 years going after 1, probably have a better career, militated in favor of me going to law school. And so I took the LSAT and did reasonably well on that, and had reasonably good grades after I drug them up from my engineering experience through political science. You know, I learned that I could do a 3-page paper in about an hour and a half if I gave it some thought, and that turned out to be very helpful in my law career as well, although it seems to take longer now. But in any event, I applied to several law schools. 2 criteria. They had to be a good law school, and they had to be in a city of 500,000 or more, because I had never lived in a big town. You know, my hometown was about 7,000 people. Purdue was at West Lafayette, which was about 20,000, not counting the students, and Lafayette itself was about 80,000. And so I thought that I could try it for 3 years, get a degree, and if I didn't like it, I could go somewhere else. I could even go home, because the family name probably still had a cachet to it of some sort. And so I applied to Vanderbilt, I applied to Tulane, I applied to Washington University in St. Louis, Georgetown and George Washington in DC, and the only thing I ever got back from them was the canceled check for the application. And Valparaiso University, which would have been my backup because that was fairly close to home.
Right.
That was
right.
my safety school, if you will. As it turned out, Vanderbilt was the very first one that responded favorably. Bob Covington, as most everybody who ever sees this video will know, was at that time the Dean of Admissions at Vanderbilt, and I think my understanding is that at that point in time, Vanderbilt had decided to go from being a regional law school to trying to become a national law school, such as it is now. And you know, having grown up in northern Indiana and gone to school in northern Indiana, I think that made me somewhat attractive to the school. The interesting thing is I got a call from the Dean of Students up there, and I figured I was in trouble. I didn't know what I'd done, but I'm sure there was something that I could have been punished for. But he called to tell me that in all the years he'd been the Dean of Students up there, it was the first time he had ever gotten a thank you letter for writing a recommendation from a law school. And apparently Dean Covington had written a thank you letter to him simply for having provided a recommendation. And I said, well, that's pretty cool. This sounds like a good place. And so I accepted and came down to Nashville, first time I'd ever been here, 2 weeks before classes started. And
this was in '73, in the fall?
This was in the fall of '73. I graduated from Purdue in the spring. And I came down 2 weeks before classes and found a place to live. That's an interesting story in and of itself. It was 1/3 of a 3-car garage that had been converted to what the owner of the home called a sleeping room. And that's where I was for my first year.
Where was this located?
It was on 19th Avenue South.
Okay.
Here in
Sure.
Nashville. And so I was there for the first year. It had a bed, a desk, a chair, a walk-in closet, a bathroom, a 5 cubic foot refrigerator, and a hot plate. And that was home for a year.
John, had you done anything in undergraduate school to prepare yourself for law school other than being a poli-sci major? Had you been in any type of speech or debate activities?
No, I joined the political science fraternity and was in that. Interestingly enough, Perdue is a very conservative school in a very conservative state. And the members of the political science fraternity were, shall we say, on the other end of the spectrum, which was interesting because I find myself sometimes a little more towards the middle of the road on certain issues. But that was about all I did. I belonged to a fraternity and was involved with that. And pretty much those last 2 years was involved with dragging my grades up from the engineering experience.
Tell us about your first year in law school and the pains and the joys that you experienced.
Well, I got down here and I didn't have very much money. The fortunate thing was I was getting $225 a month from the GI Bill, although that didn't start right away. That was a little delayed. And the summer before law school, I had worked for the W.T. Grant Company, which was a department store chain that subsequently went out of business, and quite frankly, I'm not surprised based upon everything that happened to me. But I had been selling appliances, you know, washers, dryers, refrigerators, you know, things like that, and had a pretty good commission check coming. And so I left to come down here, and the manager of the store in Lafayette held my check for about 4 months because he was convinced that I had had my friends come in to buy things so that I could get a commission, but that then they would come back and return everything that they had bought. And so the company would be out the commission. It wasn't true, but that was what he did. So I got down here, and it was in fairly short order. I was pretty well broke. And so, you know, I was on 19th Avenue South, and, you know, as anybody new to an area will do, I got out and started walking around to see what was going on, and I found there was a grocery, I think it was called Compton's Food Town at the time.
Exactly.
Up by a Blankenship drugstore, if I'm not mistaken. But across the street from them was a little place called Brown's Diner. And I found Brown's Diner and went up, and I would order a couple of beers and nurse them for an hour and a half or 2 hours. And finally the owner came over and said, you know, what's the deal? You come up here, you sit at the bar, you don't eat anything, you nurse a couple of beers. And I said, well, I frankly don't have any money. I'm waiting to get some money, but I can't study all the time. I told him I was a law student. And I said, I can't study all the time, and I've got to get out. I'm in a little 1/3 of a 3-car garage. That's not much fun. And so I come up here and have a couple of beers and watch your TV because I don't have one. And he gave me a job. And so he said, you can come up here and work a couple nights a week. And he paid me $13 a night under the table, cash. I think the statute of limitations probably is run on that for both he and me. And I could eat, and I could have a beer or two, and it actually saved me.
Serendipity.
And, it actually saved me. And so that was a fun part of it. And, you know, some of my classmates would come up and have a few beers, and that helped a lot. I didn't really join anything that first year. I tried to concentrate on my studies, but I was older than most of the students. There were I think 8 or 10 of us that were appreciably older. Well, Leda Trauger was a classmate, and she and I are of an age. Steve Rush. I mean, there were a few others that were a little bit older, and so we were disinclined to participate in much of the hijinks. And so, you know, it was study, work. We had some good parties on the weekends, but you know, the first year, as everybody knows, was pretty tough. You're getting exposed to things you don't have any idea about.
Were you in Matt Sweeney's class?
Yeah, Matt Sweeney was in that class. Lucinda Smith, Marnie Huff, Keith London. I know I'm going to leave a bunch of super people out.
Well, you've already named a group that turned out to be leaders in the bar.
You know, let me see. Larry Maxwell was in that class. Keith Simmons, Craig Gabbert, Kay Gabbert. You know, Lucinda Smith, Marnie Huff. I think I mentioned them. Yeah, it was quite a class. We had a lot of fun. Everybody was serious, but nobody was cutthroat, and that was the best part of it. You know, I mean, people would help. I mean, I didn't try out for law review. I had no interest in that. But folks like Bob Brownlee and Greg Grimsley, who were on the law review, would always invite me in for coffee. It wasn't a clannish kind of thing or an elitist kind of thing. And I think that's what kind of convinced me at some point during law school that while grades are important, of course, the old joke, what do you call the last person in the class at law school? Lawyer, assuming they get past that little quiz. And I decided that developing relationships was, to me, a little more important. And I've done that, and quite frankly, I think it stood me in good stead over the course of time.
Were there any professors or classes that first year that struck you as being super or super hard?
Well, we had a murderer's row. We had Paul Hartman, the Dutchman, teaching contracts, and he was always pretty tough.
That's always memorable.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. John Charney taught civil procedure. John Wade taught torts. Let me see, who else? Don Hall, of course, who became a lifelong friend until his untimely passing, taught criminal law. Tom McCoy taught constitutional law. And I mean, that was murderer's row. That was tough teachers. But it was fun, and you learned from them. And back then, I don't know if it's that way now, back then there was a real open door policy. You know, and literally their doors would be open, and you'd walk by, and if they were really focused on something, you'd let them be. If not, you'd knock on the door if you had a question or something you needed to talk to them about. But the one that I got closest to was Don Hall. And I hope all the rest of them will forgive me for this, but he was a teacher who wrote instead of a writer who taught. And I think that made a big difference. You know, I was on his first national moot court team because he had been recruited by Dent Bostic to come up from Florida to teach at Vanderbilt. He had been in private practice down there. And I think had been one of Dent's students when he was down there in Florida. And he came up, and I was on his first team with Susan Chrisman and John Villios, who were also classmates. And we did quite well. They were the oralist. I was the brief writer. And we wound up going to the national competition and tied for third in the country. So that was exciting. That was in our third year. But I got to know Don in the first year.
Right. And did you do moot court the second year, or was that just a third year?
The second year, I think, as I recall, was tryouts for it and selection. And then when you came back for the beginning of the third year was when you got the national problem and began working on it. And I'll never forget, it had to do with something called the Noor-Pennington Doctrine, and to this day I have no idea what that is. So, you know, I may have learned it then, but I certainly put it out of my mind quickly enough.
Well, for the team to come in third nationally, you must have learned it at the time.
Well, the other two people on the team were sterling. It's the amazing thing about it was during the entire competition, including in the finals in New York. They were the only people that went up to the podium with absolutely no notes. They had it in their heads that solidly, and they were amazing, and that's what did it.
Where did you go for the Nationals?
Nationals was in New York City, and quick little story. I mean, these little asides are probably going to extend the time of this.
No, these are the fun things.
Susan and John at the time became a bit of an item. And so they would go off, as Don used to say, to practice. And so Don and I would be sitting there by ourselves, and we stayed at the Algonquin in New York City, which was pretty phenomenal. And so he and I would, during the time leading up to, we got up there a few days early, we would sit at the bar at the Algonquin, and we had lunch one day, and the next table over, Van Cliburn was sitting there. I mean, it was quite a thing. Pardon me. And so that's where I really learned to know Don. I took a couple of other classes from him, and ultimately wound up living. We bought a house just down the street from Don's house, and got to know Don and Nancy and his girls very, very well. And they got to know our kids, and he became a dear friend. He and Nancy both became dear friends, even beyond law school. So if there's one person that stands out in my mind about law school that made it more tolerable than it otherwise might have been, it was Don. It was Don.
John, as you got into your second and third years, did you continue to work at Brown's Diner, or did you find other things?
Oh, I found other things. I was extremely fortunate to interview with a fellow from Dyersburg for a summer clerk position after that first year of law school, a fellow named Joe Boyd. Martha, his daughter, is practicing here in town. She's a fine lawyer, doing very, very well. But Joe interviewed, and this was during Watergate, and he asked me a bunch of pointed questions about my thoughts about it, and I guess my answer satisfied him because he hired me. And so I wound up spending that first summer in Dyersburg, and I learned a great deal from Joe. He was actually my first mentor. He actually taught me a lot of things. I mean, one of the things that stuck with me to this day is he says that you'll never win a lawsuit on your complaint, but you can lose it, which, is the kind of wisdom that somebody needs to hear. And so I clerked for him after my first year of law school, and then as it turned out, and I'm trying to remember whether it was I think it was beginning my second year of law school. I got hired as a clerk for a law firm called Barrett, Brandt & Barrett. And I think I've got my timelines right. It's possible it was the beginning of my third year, but no, I don't think so. No, it wasn't. It was the beginning of my second year. It was George Barrett, Citizen Barrett, Bob Brandt, who was chancellor here for a long time, and Lionel Barrett, a preeminent criminal defense lawyer. And the associates in that firm were Charlie Ray, a long-time preeminent criminal defense lawyer in his own right, and Jim Niffen, who was a good lawyer. And the other clerk was that person I mentioned earlier, Oleta Trauger. And I was the clerk. It was a very interesting group of people to work with. My understanding of what happened was that George and Lionel hired Oleta to basically help them. And I'm not going to say Lionel felt left out, but I think Lionel wanted to have somebody as well. And he did so much criminal defense work. He said, I can't send a woman to the main prison, and so I need to hire a guy. And so I got hired, and one of my main jobs was to go out to the main prison to interview inmates who might have some knowledge of whatever crime had been committed by one of Lionel's clients.
The walls.
The walls. The old, the one you see in the opening scene of The Green Mile. I mean, it was that place. And knock on wood, I had never been arrested for anything before, so I had never felt the panic of having iron bars clang behind you until I went out to interview the first witness. and it was scary and remains scary to this day. And as a consequence, that was part of what my job was. The other problem was Lionel didn't pay a great deal of attention to detail in some regards, and he burned up the engine on his company car by thinking that when the oil light came on, it was just the bulb, and it wasn't. It was that it was out of oil. And so one of my jobs was to go out and check every day to make sure that Lionel had oil in his car. And then another job that I had, and this is kind of off track, but it's kind of an experience that most young lawyers and law students probably can relate to. George, come every fall, would bring in all of the flowering plants that bloomed out at his house. He would have them brought in, and then in the spring he would have them taken back out. And that became my job, where I would go out and pick up all of his plants, bring them to the Third National Bank building, and get on the elevator and bring them up and put them in his office and arrange them the way he wanted. And then come the spring, I would pick them up and take them back out to his house. But in the meanwhile, in fairness, I learned a lot. And that was an interesting group of people, all very, very bright, all very, very good. And so I learned a great deal. And so I did that for quite a while.
Did you have an experience while you were still in law school clerking for the Tennessee Supreme Court?
I did. In my third year, Ann Brandt, bless her, was just wonderful as the placement director at the time. And she and I would talk, and I would explain to her that being older, I'd already been through basic training once, and I didn't think I wanted to go to a law firm where I would be doing basic training again for 6 or 7 years to have a hope of a partnership, something like that. And we talked quite a bit. And so at the beginning of my last semester, in my third year, she called me in, and as it turned out, Joe Henry, who was a Supreme Court justice, had lost his law clerk. His law clerk left early to take a position in Franklin, and his new law clerk wasn't due to come in for a couple of months, and so I got to clerk as a law student, my third year law school, for 2 whole months for Joe Henry. And that was a great experience too. He was very bright. The interesting thing was he actually paid attention to what I had to say. Of course, then he often went off and disregarded what I had to say, but at least he listened. And the other interesting thing about that was he had 2 or 3 opinions written about what he wanted to say as a Supreme Court justice, waiting for the case to come up so he could plug the names in. Because he knew what he wanted to do. I can't even remember what any of them were, but I found that fascinating. He came in with an agenda, and I think he employed it fairly successfully. But so I did that for 2 whole months, and that was a lot of fun.
That sounds like it would be just a dream job.
Oh, it was great.
Third year of law school.
I can't remember. Chief Justice Phone's secretary, whose name escapes me at the moment, called us Cub Scouts. You know, all the law clerks up there were Cub Scouts, and so you know, we were all members of the pack. And even though I had only been up there for 2 months, you know, I became a full-fledged Cub Scout.
This brings us, I think, to, let's see, the spring of
76.
76. And young John Kitch graduates from Vanderbilt Law School.
Yep.
What was on your horizon?
Well, I told you that Ann Brandt was a great placement director, and she got me a position with a lawyer out in Goodletsville at Rivergate named Bill Hoddy. And it was interesting because in that last semester of law school, after working for Justice Henry, he decided to hire me. You know, Ann looked me up and I interviewed, and he decided to hire me. And he also hired my secretary, Debbie Hickerson, at the time. Debbie had worked for an architect for 9 years who died, and was looking for another position, and her sister-in-law was working for Bill. And so Bill hired Debbie, through the recommendation of the sister-in-law, to be my secretary before I even got out of law school. And you know, I remember going out, you know, I then graduated, and I then passed the bar, and I was ready to go to work. I mean, I'd gone out and done some clerky type things, you know, for Bill. And at that time, I went out and talked to Debbie, and I said, Debbie, I've never had a secretary before. I don't know what you do. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with you. And you know, she is a very matter-of-fact person. She said, I want to be paid on time. I want to be able to leave at 5 or so to go home and be able to fix dinner for my husband. And I want to be proud to be able to say who I work for, not ashamed. I said, well, I'll do the best I can on all 3 counts. And so far, up until she retired, I managed to pay her on time most of the time. There were some times when it was a little lean, and she bore with me. Hopefully she never felt embarrassed to say who she worked for, and she usually got out around 5 o'clock.
Well, that turned out in your career to be a very important thing, because she was right in there with you for what, 25 years?
No, 38.
38?
She was my secretary for 38 years. She was remarkable. She had gone to Hume Fogg at a time when it was a trade school. And the boys were studying auto mechanics and industrial arts. The girls studied being secretaries or bookkeepers. And she graduated in 3 years with a high school diploma as a secretary, and then went to work for the architect, and then when he passed, came to work for me, and worked for me for 38 years. And until, I guess, about 5 years ago, she said, I think I'm going to retire. And at that point in time, I went into a mild panic, because she did so many things for me that I didn't otherwise know what to do. But anyway, yeah, she was more than instrumental in whatever success I've had. She kept me on the straight and narrow, and if it wasn't for her, I couldn't have done it.
How long did you work for Bill Hottie in the Hendersonville area?
I think I worked for him for about 2.5 years, and for a number of reasons, I decided to move on. And you know, we parted amicably, and you know, did what I recommend that people do now when you split: write a joint letter to all the clients that you worked on and ask them who they wanted to keep their file, because of course it's the client's files. And you know, I had a number that went with me, a number that stayed with him, and at that point I went downtown to Parkway Towers to work with Clyde Holland and another classmate of mine, Richardson Lynn, who since has been the dean at Pepperdine Law School and at John Marshall Law School in Atlanta, Georgia. He tried retirement, and it was unsuccessful for him, and so he's back practicing. I think he's got a shingle. He's got a place here in Nashville, and I think he's got a place. I can't remember if it's Oklahoma or Nebraska or Missouri, but he's back at it. He can't quit, just like I can. And so I went down there, and then we moved over to a place later on Music Row, and I worked over there with a fairly significant group of people, and finally decided that I needed to branch out on my own. Now you understand, I was a solo for all intent and purpose for 38 years. You know, I was in space sharing arrangements and where we shared expenses, but it's always been an eat what you kill kind of thing. And as a consequence, I felt like I had enough of a book of business to go out on my own, and I did. And I wound up down just past Hillsborough Road, going out toward Green Hills, next to what was the actual Church of Christ before it was acquired. And I stayed out there, well, up until about 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think when most lawyers think about you, they think about that office because that became sort of synonymous with you and your practice.
I was there for a long, long while. And most of it on a month-to-month. They could have kicked me out, but I guess it was worth having me.
Well, this is important, and I want you to take a minute. How did you sort of develop your practice on your own? Because most lawyers in Nashville who have been here for a while know that not only was what you did with a great deal of your practice, but that when you became president of the bar, you emphasized the need to remember solo practitioners.
Yes. Well, the way I did it, you know, I started out with Bill, and Bill was kind enough to let me try cases and deal with with many of his existing clients. And as I say, some of the business came with me when I left. But I basically was a threshold lawyer. You know, if it walked across my threshold with a checkbook, you know, I'd take it. Now, I didn't do criminal work. I dabbled in bankruptcy once and learned that that was not something I ought to be doing. And I just tried to develop a civil practice, and you know, I gained the vast majority of whatever business I have had through word of mouth from people I had done work for. You know, people who would come back for other things, or people who would refer to somebody else. And back then is when I developed the habit of giving out 2 business cards instead of just one. One for them to keep and one for them to give to somebody else. And surprisingly, that has been a very good practice, because I have had people call me up saying that Mary Jones gave me your card, but Mary Jones kept it so she could still get in touch with me if she had a need. So, you know, I basically took whatever walked in the door to keep body and soul together. And I guess I got what I would call a break back in the early 80s, where I'd been out on my own for a little while. And that was kind of a difficult time. I was making enough money to feed my family or to pay taxes, and it was an or, not an and or. And so I fed the family and wound up getting behind on taxes. Now I filed my returns like I was supposed to, and hoped that they would forget that there was no check with them. Of course, they didn't. And so I wound up having to pay back a fair amount of taxes when things got better. But in 1985, I got a call from a woman who was general counsel for the Department of Education, asking me, did I know anything about special education? And I said no, because I didn't. She says, well, we would like to have you interviewed to be a hearing officer for special education cases. And I said, well, what does that involve? She said, well, you would be a part-time administrative law judge. You pay $65 an hour for the time you're working. And I said, well, I'll give it a whirl. So I went and interviewed. And I guess it was a good thing that I didn't know who I was interviewing with, because at that time, the special education community was divided among school personnel who thought that the parent personnel were just out for a fast buck, and the parent personnel who thought that the school people just didn't care. And I have since learned that neither of them was correct, because school people do care, and the parent people, advocates and the like, are not just out for a fast buck. So I interviewed, and I guess I got the job when I confessed that I knew absolutely nothing, didn't have an axe to grind. That was the way it was. And as it turned out, I got hired for the position along with a number of other folks who became part-time hearing officers. And so that was in 1985. We were appointed by Charles Frazier, who at that time was the cabinet member over education, commissioner over education. And after 4 years, I had gained a rumor that turned out to be true, that we were none of us going to be reappointed. I'm not entirely sure why, I think that there may have been some opinions, hopefully none that I wrote, but there may have been some opinions that Commissioner Frazier just didn't like, or he thought were over the top, or whatever. And so I resigned after 4 years. And I promptly got a call from Frank Van Cleve. By the way, John Van Cleve is another one of my classmates from law school here in town. Frank's his brother, and Frank had actually been a lawyer in a case involving Tullahoma City schools that had been assigned to me. We had a pre-hearing conference and the case settled, so he apparently liked the way I handled the conference, and so he called me and asked me if I would help with one that they had going. And I said, sure. I had already resigned. I saw no conflict. And that was my first school system client, Tullahoma City Schools, and I gained a whole lot more since then. You know, they come and they go like all clients, but over the course of time, I have either represented or given in-services to probably 50 public school systems around the state.
I was going to say, for the next 25 years, that was a big part of your practice.
And it remains so today. I still do a lot of that kind of work. I have, you know, a couple of federal court cases going right now, and a bunch of administrative cases. And I like doing it because everybody in the process is really trying to do right by the kids. And you know, I'm going to sound like kind of a Pollyanna about that, but the people in the public school system are hamstrung by a lack of funding for this sort of thing, but they absolutely do the best they can with what they got, and they love these kids. And of course, it's hard on the parents. The parents love the kids. The parents have wants and needs for their kids, and the process is supposed to wind up in consensus over what is the proper program. That doesn't always work, and that's where we get into some of these disputes. But it's not like anybody in the process isn't trying to do the best thing as they see it for these children. And that's what makes it enjoyable to work in that field.
Well, as a compliment to you, is there a school system in Middle Tennessee that hasn't had you represent them?
Oh, I could probably think of one, but over the course of time, you know, I actually did work for Metro for a fair period of time. Metro Nashville. I've done work for Rutherford County, done some work for Williamson County back in the day. You know, a lot of these systems, you know, move on to in-house people or other firms that do more than just the special education work, which is really all I do now. I've done some discrimination defense in other contexts and things like that, but this is mostly what I do. But yeah, I've represented a lot of them: Clarksville, Montgomery County, Tullahoma City Schools.
Williamson County?
Williamson County I did work for back in the day. Murfreesboro City, Franklin Special. I mean,
yeah.
And I like it.
Well, I know it's been very important in your practice. Are there any, John, you know, looking, and I say looking back, you haven't retired yet, are there any particular cases, whether they involve special ed or not, that you wanted to talk about?
Well, the one in Tullahoma, the first one I got hired for, went all the way to the Sixth Circuit and created a standard in special education, and the Supreme Court was asked to take it and didn't, so it's still good law. You know, I've done appellate work over the course of time quite a bit. As a matter of fact, there are times I advertised for it and had a number of very fine lawyers who just didn't want to do appellate work hire me to help them with it. You know, and I used to do an awful lot of divorce work for some of the lawyers, appellate work. You know, I don't know that anything particularly stands out. I mean, you know, when people ask me my one-loss record, and I really don't know, because I've won them I should have lost, and I've lost them I should have won. And I guess every lawyer can say that. So I don't know if there's anything that particularly stands out other than that very first one. There are a few that have been in front of the Supreme Court. I will say I had one that went up to the Supreme Court, and in the middle of my argument, the justices all slid back on their chairs, went into a circle, and had about a 5-minute conversation. And all I could think of was, oh damn, what have I done? Am I going to get held in contempt by the entire Supreme Court? As it turned out, I never did find out what they were talking about. But that was a case that was interesting, that went up on issues that had absolutely nothing to do with what they ultimately decided it on. They decided it based upon a procedural flaw in the way the probate court at the time, Jim Everett and his special master, handled something by not having a court report. It had nothing to do with the merits of the case, but that's pretty memorable when the whole court backs off, circles, and you don't know why. It was a little disconcerting, to say the least.
In the course of all this, and spending so many years as a sole practitioner, I think you put the knowledge you gained to use as a teacher. Am I right?
I have been teaching at the Nashville School of Law since 1999.
How did that happen?
Well, I went out to the Nashville Bar Association golf tournament, and as a solo, I didn't have a team, and I got matched up with Joe Loser to ride in his cart, and he, of course, at the time was the dean at the NSL. And as we were playing my bad and his pretty adequate brand of golf around the course that day, we got to talking, and I mentioned something about being a solo, and he says, well, how do you manage your firm? And I said, it isn't a firm, it's me. And I manage it because I've got a great secretary that can handle most of it, and I do the rest. And I said, you know, I've even thought about teaching a course at Vanderbilt about how to manage a small office firm. And he says, well, why don't you work up a syllabus? Well, okay. And so I scratched something together, probably took me a half an hour, and scratched something together and sent it over to him. And I get a call about 2 or 3 weeks later saying, your class has been approved by the Board of Trustees. It begins on whatever day it was. And I said, oh damn, now I've got to come up with a class.
All of a sudden it's Professor Kitch.
Yeah, well, yeah, or whatever they call them over at the NSL. And I put it together, and I started doing it in 1999. And, you know, the thrust of it was, the impetus for it was, I got out of law school not knowing how to be a lawyer. And I think a lot of my classmates, a lot of people, maybe even some now that are graduating, you don't get out of law school knowing how to be a lawyer. You get out of law school knowing law. And they're not the same, as anybody who's ever practiced knows. I mean, and you got to keep, you know, fees coming in. You've got to have a work-life balance, you know, or you go crazy. And so that was the impetus for me. I got out of Vanderbilt, and I did not know that I had to have 2 separate accounts, one for checking for me and one for my client's money. And you know, the theory, I guess, at that time was that a young lawyer will go with the firm, and the firm will handle that and will educate you to that as time goes on. Well, there are an awful lot of people who come out of law school, like me, who don't want to go with the firm, want to hang out their own shingle, and so that's kind of where I began it. And so I put together, you know, a course, and it was kind of about, don't forget it's a profession, but remember it's a business. And, you know, one of the things that I see from a lot of law students is they really want to do public service. They really want to do pro bono. And I tell them, I said, that's wonderful, but you've got to be able to live yourself in order to help clients. And I use the example of the airplane, when they give you the information about the oxygen mask dropping, to put the mask over your own face before you put it over your child so that you both don't pass out and you're still able to, well, it's the same thing with pro bono. You know, you can pro bono yourself to death. And so I try and teach them some of the nuts and bolts that I have had to learn over the course of time, to be, you know, how to make a living while practicing law and doing good. And I've had a lot of people come back and say that they've enjoyed the class and that it's good, and they still have me teaching it about once a year as an elective, and I'm grateful to Dean Koch for letting me do it, because I get as much out of it as, and I call them kids. They're not kids, some of them are older than me, and some of them have had careers of their own that have been very successful before they decided to go to law school. So I start out my class by telling them that there are some of you in here who know everything I'm going to teach you. Please bear with me, because there are some of you who don't.
Exactly. And that class, I know, is talked about by many graduates as being vital to their ability to make a living in law practice once they graduate.
Well, I hope it's been helpful.
John, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, you changed from being just a solo practitioner. Tell us about that.
Well, my secretary retired, told me she was going to retire, and it quickly came to mind that I had no clue as to hire a secretary. Didn't know I didn't know how to hire one. I didn't know what attributes to look for or anything like that. I mean, I've been talking about it in my class for quite some time, but gosh, putting it to the test was going to be a little bit something else. Plus, I would have been by myself in a 1,500 square foot office suite, and I'd rattle around in there like a BB in a boxcar. And I also was approaching an age. Now, I had had some informal arrangements for backup in case something happened to me. But I was getting to the age where it was more likely that something might happen to me, you know, ill health or something like that. And I wanted my clients to have backup. I wanted them to not be left in the cold if I died all of a sudden. And as it turned out, I was at the NSL, and Tom Carlton, you know, great lawyer, great guy who taught out there, and Dan Barexa, another great fellow, happened to be out there while I was grumbling about trying to figure out what to do. And they said, why don't you come talk to us? And so I did. Came over and met with all of the partners, and we talked about an of-counsel position.
Now, this is Cornelius Collins.
Cornelius and Collins, right. A long-standing, excellent firm with a tremendous reputation. I'll tell you what I did was I called Sandy Garrett out to Board of Professional Responsibility to find out whether or not they were as good as they seemed to be on paper. And she raved about them, and I said, okay, that's good. I trust Sandy's judgment. And if she hadn't had any problems with them, they're probably okay. And as it turned out, I guess it's been about 5 years ago this month that I went to work up there of counsel, and it's been a delight. And I've learned a lot from them. They're all great people. You know, I will say this, they are not a Ponzi law firm like some I have seen, where the senior partners are still dragging a lot of money out and not doing any work. And they keep having to hire new associates to, you know, put in 2,500 hours a year so that the senior partners can drag the money from the associates. It's not like that. Everybody at that firm works. And it's hierarchical in the sense that you've got partners, associates, of counsel, and staff, but everybody's treated the same. It's just very pleasant, and that I'll go out working over there.
Well, that's good for them and good for you too, because it's a firm that's been a leader in the Nashville legal community ever since I've been in practice. Well, let's loop back for a minute, if you don't mind.
No, that's fine.
We sort of left out some things in your life that we ought to cover, and I know you want to. Tell us about how you met Jackie and about your family.
My wife Jackie, we've been married, actually this September 1st will be 40 years. She made me get married on Labor Day, so I'd never forget our anniversary, and of course then the government goes and changes when Labor Day is celebrated. But I was working for Bill Hottie out in Rivergate, and My wife now was the teller at the drive-up window. And I used to drive up to the window to make the deposits of what little money I had. And we began chatting, and she likes to tell the story that I would then start coming in the bank and standing in the line in front of her teller cage when there were other teller lines open, just to pass the time of day. And so that's how we met, and we dated a while and married. And we have 3 kids, TJ, Thomas, Jonathan, we call him TJ, my daughter Heather, and my son Daniel. TJ and Heather I adopted when TJ was 2.5 and Heather was 6 months.
Right.
Jackie's by prior marriage, and Daniel is ours together. No matter, they're all 3 my kids. And then I have 3 granddaughters, 2 in Florida from TJ and 1 up here from Heather. They're all gainfully employed out of my checkbook. And all I can say is I'm grateful for both of those things. They're all doing really well, and I'm just very happy to have such a great family.
Has Jackie continued to do some work outside of the home?
She is not working outside of the home right now. She's involved with our church, and she teaches crocheting to people that want to learn it. And mainly, keeps me on the straight and narrow, at home. She's active with the Daughters of the King in the Episcopal Church, and that keeps her fairly happy too. So,
well, that's a good lead into another area of your life that I know about, and I think it's basically the way we met, other than having TJ in the scout troop. But
yeah.
At St. David's Episcopal Church, you've held just about every leadership position there over, 40 years.
Well, I'm serving my 3rd time on the vestry. I've been junior warden and senior warden. It's a great place. The lawyers who are watching this will be interested to know that Jackie and I just decided to go up there one time. It's nestled on a hill in West Meade that you can't find unless you're looking for it. Of course, now that there's GPS, folks, just put it in your GPS and come. But it wasn't that easy before, because West Meade is twisty and turny and up and down. And we decided to go in there one time, and the first time we went was in the summer, and they changed the schedule, and so we got there an hour after church was out. But then the next time we went back, we walked in, and I met Gareth, and I met Joe Farrelly, and I met a number of other lawyers in that church, Raymond Leathers, Bart Leathers, and it's a very welcoming place, always has been, always will be, and so we found it as our church home.
Well, you certainly have been a leader there, and that leadership has been appreciated. You've also been a leader in the Bar Association. How did you get involved in bar work?
Well, you remember when I was talking about back in the 1985 era, I didn't have enough money to feed my family and pay taxes? I said to myself, here I am, I'm not downtown, I don't see lawyers every day. Even on the Friday morning motion docket, I'm not down there as often as I would like, so I've got to do something to meet lawyers. And I figured, selfishly, if I met lawyers, let them know what I did, they might send me referrals. And so I decided, initially from a selfish motive, to get involved with the bar. And so I joined a couple of committees and worked on them. And over the course of time, got to know a lot of other leaders in the bar, and I finally decided, what the hell, I'll run for the bar board. And I did, and I figured, this is selfish again, and this is beating my own chest and patting myself on the back. I wanted to show them that being a solo didn't stop you from doing other good, fun stuff. So I ran for the bar board and got elected. I think a lot of my colleagues, from my class in law school helped. You know, I know Lady Trauger at one point nominated me for something, and others have been supporting Sweeney and other folks like that. And so I ran for the bar board and got elected. And the first time around, I wound up being first vice president behind Gail Ashworth as president. And of course, Gail Ashworth is a bar junkie, so I didn't have much of anything to do except show up. I mean, it wasn't like she'd ever miss a meeting or would ever miss an event. And I got known a little bit in that. And then I ran again later and got elected and decided at that point in time, and between those, I wound up being the president of the Bar Foundation. It has evolved way beyond my wildest imagination now to what it is today, and it's just tremendous.
That's happened during our lifetime.
It's happened, you know, relatively recently, and it's magnificent. I mean, what they've done. We weren't like that then. But anyway, I had the privilege of serving for a couple of years as that. And then I decided to run for the president. And at that time, I was fortunate because the other people who might have run, one of them was Randy Kennedy, who couldn't run because he was a sitting judge, and he became my first vice, and Marietta Shipley had recently retired as a judge and was building her mediation practice. And so I kind of ran unopposed, but not really, but kind of. And I think I was the first solo who was actually a practicing lawyer who had had the position in about 40 years.
That's my recollection. Is that
something like that.
Yeah.
And again, my secretary Debbie, I mean, she was magnificent in keeping everything going while I was doing bar stuff.
Tell us about that year. Did you enjoy it?
Oh, I loved it. Loved every minute. And I went to everything I could. And the best part of it was I didn't have to do that much. You know, we set up a governance process where Randy was in charge of governance and Marietta was in charge of membership. And we had all the committees, and I learned the art of delegation. And I have held it to my heart ever since that as the president or leader of anything, your job is about threefold. One, show up and be the face of the organization. Two, delegate all the things that have to be done. And three, follow up to make sure they're getting done.
Did you have good staff support?
I had a marvelous staff, and I had marvelous committee chairs, and I had marvelous people on the board with me at the time. It was easy. And, you know, I mean, I recruited Tom Sherrard. Tom Sherrard said, I don't know if I've got the time to do this. Tom, all you have to do is tell the people what you want done. It'll get done. Show up and smile. And he has turned out, he followed me, and he was a great bar president too. But I really enjoyed it. It was easy. It was fun. I'd do it again, except I don't know they'd want an old guy like me.
What's the importance of the Nashville bar in our practice here in Nashville?
Well, gosh, there's so many things I could say. The biggest one is getting young lawyers to come in and learn from older lawyers, to mix and mingle, to get to know people and get known by people. The bar has all of this great committee structure. You can find something to do that's in your interest area. You know, and you can, I mean, the probate court committee, you know, federal court committee, chancery circuit, bankruptcy committee. I mean, there's so many committees that you can get involved in. The veterans committee, one I'm pretty proud of. I really think that it's the opportunity to learn for young lawyers, and for that matter, lawyers our age. It's the opportunity to be collegial, to get to know lawyers. I mean, my experience, you know, I got this from not Ward DeWitt. I'm having one of those.
Charlie Warfield?
Charlie Warfield, one of those brain spasms. Charlie Warfield, if you break bread with somebody, you can't be ugly to them. And so that's another element of the benefit of the bar, is that you get to know people. Because right now, There are lawyers sitting behind a keyboard being snarky because they don't have to look the guy at the other end of the keyboard in the face. And Charlie Warfield was a great mentor of mine, kind of involuntarily. He was on the other side of cases and taught me what it was like to be a honest, good, straightforward lawyer.
From all of your years in practice, John, and I know you practiced in a lot of different counties, a lot of different cities and courts, how does Nashville stack up as far as collegiality?
I think it's pretty good. We all know the people that are difficult. Knowing of their difficultness, we can deal with them. But the vast majority of lawyers, you can pick up the phone and say, hey, can I have a 2-week extension on filing my appellate brief? Would you agree with me that it's okay and I can put it into motion? Will you give me an extension on answering these interrogatories? And of course, we also know the lawyers who will abuse those kind of things. But by the main, this is a great place to practice law, and I wouldn't want to go anywhere else. And we've got lawyers that are willing to help young lawyers, and that's really important to me. I mean, when I was president of the bar, I was able to convince the board that we needed to have a mentorship program. Because I had never, Bill Hottie tried to be a mentor, but he was so busy with his own things it was difficult. Joe Boyd was my first mentor that first summer after law school, and I still thank him for it every day. And I learned from Charlie Warfield and Ward DeWitt and others like that, lions of the bar, what it's like to be able to be a zealous advocate, but pleasant as well. And I think that most of the people in the bar are that way. Of course, I've heard when I was a young lawyer coming in, I heard that all the old guys were not very collegial. And now that I'm an old guy, I hear that all the young ones coming in are not very collegial. And I don't think either one of them's right, because we do pretty well. And we're professionals. We know that we're going to run across the same lawyers time after time. Why piss them off to the point where they're not going to like you?
We're just about at the close of this fascinating interview, but before we close, I wanted to ask you if you had seen a great deal of change in law practice during your career, and if so, what's good, what's bad?
Yeah. We didn't used to be able to go on a computer and save things. We had to create everything from scratch from whatever paper we had from the previous files. We didn't have instant communication. I mean, I remember not recently, within the past few years, I got an email from a young lawyer, and 15 minutes later I got a phone call asking why I hadn't responded to his email. And, back in the day, we used to be able to write a letter and, call it playing tennis. I had written a letter, I had sent it out, I had hit it across the net, the ball across the net, and I had 2 or 3 days before my colleague on the other end was going to get it and respond, so I could actually have time to think. Nowadays, it's instantaneous stuff. And those of us who come from that slightly slower paced time, I don't think we're all that fond of it. But then again, my time is my time, and an emergency on your part does not necessarily mean a crisis on mine. And so I don't have to respond instantaneously. I turn my cell phone off from time to time because I don't want to get calls. Now, I usually don't do that because my wife of almost 40 years needs access from time to time. But I mean, I've made it a point to try and only read emails on my office computer twice a day, because you can't focus on anything if you're answering emails all day. And how many emails a day do we all get? So that's a big change. I have to tell you, when my father was practicing law back in northern Indiana, back in the 50s and 60s, he got the first electric typewriter in town, the very first one. And his secretary was just thrilled, because previously she had an upright Remington that you had to hammer the keys, because what you did was you had a piece of paper, carbon paper, onion skin, carbon paper, onion skin, you had to hammer the keys. She thought that was the greatest thing since sliced bread. well, where are we now? I mean, you know, what is it, 70 years later, and things are in the cloud? I mean, that's been a big change.
John, no lawyer our age ever forgets the first copy machine that he or she ever saw.
That is correct.
That changed our lives.
Well, I remember the thermofax machines where, you know, that funny paper would come out of it and curl up, and you would have to then make a photocopy of that because that would fade and the copy would not. So, I mean, you know, it's changed a lot. I don't think the basic underpinnings of it, though, collegiality, professionalism, I don't think that has changed. I will say the ability to thoughtfully think about things has been speeded up because, you know, it takes me a while to digest what somebody else has sent me. And in this day and time, it seems like the time to do that is less.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say that's good or bad. I'm just going to say that, you know, what was it that Darwin said, that if we are not willing to change, we will be taken over by the insects? And I think that that's right. And that's why I would tell any young lawyer, be willing to change. I tell us old people, you and me, that we have to be willing to change. So.
Well, this has been a pleasure. Have we left anything important out, John?
The only thing I can think of is the other thing I did when president of the bar was encourage the beginning through the board of the Veterans Committee. As I'm sure you are aware, we have an awful lot of veterans coming back from various conflicts with an awful lot of issues. And initially we started the Veterans Committee just to get all the lawyers who were veterans together, you know, and forgive me, to tell war stories. And I mean, we had, you know, Dale Quillen, you know, who was a Marine, and, you know, you know, so many others, Bob Tooth, captain during Vietnam, and Ed Yarborough, and all of the people that served. And it was delightful to get them together. But then we decided, talking about doing something relevant. And for example, Judge Melissa Blackburn has her Veterans Court. We're trying to figure out how to work with that. We're working with Operation Stand Down. I mentioned Joe Boyd and his daughter. She is now the head of Operation Stand Down. We've got Lucinda Smith, my classmate, who is with legal aid and does an awful lot of work with veterans. And we're trying right now to figure out a better way that the lawyers in the bar who are veterans, or even lawyers who are not veterans, can join the Veterans Committee and help these poor souls who are coming back from unimaginable things to reintegrate into society positively. PTSD is a real deal, and addiction is a real deal. Inability to cope is a real deal. And so I guess that's the one thing I'd want to leave you with is I think that I am as proud of the mentorship program and the Veterans Committee as anything that I've done in a very, very long time. And I would hope that both of those continue to have long existences and do perform the functions they were intended to perform.
Well, thank you. It has been a real pleasure and an honor to take your oral history.
Well, thank you.
John.